All right. So as everybody is coming in, good morning, good afternoon, good late evening. We have representation today from the community all over the world, which is one of the things that makes me so excited about the work we're doing and we're striving to build together. My name's Jason Dodier. I'm the co-founder and chief commercial officer of the Grain Ecosystem. As many of you know, we're fanatical about waste and ensuring that your waste is worth it. We are aiming to provide an all-in-one carbon processing unit to bring tailored precision. And our focus is on really revitalizing waste and reimagining value. So how do we help individuals that have sugar mills, lumber mills, timber mills, food processing facilities, dairy farms, you name it, turn waste into economic value with a huge emphasis on biochar and certainly entrance into the voluntary carbon market, which is going to be a major topic in our discussion today. For us at Grain, and I think for many of us on the call, the boss is the mission. So outside of sequestering carbon, it's really all about avoiding the valley of death. So we're promising technologies fail to reach commercialization, either due to lack of funding or market demand. And really to prevent this, it's essential and critical to have robust support mechanisms in place, whether that's government intervention, the voluntary carbon market, strategic investments, etc. And it's one of the reasons I'm really excited about today's discussion with Robert, because if you think about what's necessary, and he did a phenomenal recent post from the Milkywire page on LinkedIn, but thinking about funding promising experiments, investing in future breakthroughs, and maximizing innovation per dollar. What's interesting, I always go back to history. And if you look at history, innovation in many cases has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have. When Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending roughly over 100 times more on R&D. It's not about the money, it's about the people you have, how you're led, and how much you get it. And the gentleman that's joining me today that I'm about to introduce, he gets it and his companies get it, and they've been a huge part of solving the problem along with our team at Grain. So it's with pleasure that I introduce Robert Höglund. He's a visionary leader in the field of carbon dioxide removal. What's important about Robert is he's got a unique ability to translate complex scientific concepts into actionable insights. And I always go back to his bathtub analogy many times, Robert. I can't even tell you how many times I've used that analogy to explain CDR to new entrants and people that we're trying to bring in the space. But he's been at the front of driving innovation and really fostering collaboration in the CDR market, which is what we're all about here at Grain as well. And not only, many of you might know him from his work as the CEO of Milkywire, which has been aiming to increase funding for climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection, but he's also the co-founder of CDR.FYI. And at the core of that is transparency. So it's about building a credible CDR market, and platforms like CDR.FYI, which is my go-to and is what I tell everybody to check out that's curious about the space, tracking deliveries and providing up-to-date information on durable removals is so vital and so critical now more than ever. And Robert, it's an honor to be here. And I'll just say one last thing before we kick our conversation off. You know, you and I were together, God, I think it's been 6 months now, at the Biochar Carbon Revolution event here in New York City. And when you think about the 20s being the startup decade for this space, look how fast 6 months has gone by. I mean, what do you think? You know, when you think about what keeps us up at night, speed and scale to maneuver in the market. So I just want to thank you for being here. And let's kick off our conversation. We have a lot to cover. I want to leave time for some really good Q&A as well. But I'd like to start with you maybe sharing a little bit more about you and your work, some of the things you'd like to highlight. And then we can go right into, you know, one of the first questions that's one that I get a ton, which is really your vantage point on dual goals like energy production and biochar creation as an example, and how these projects come together in the broader carbon market. So let's kick off, and excited for the conversation with you today.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the invite and for those kind words in the introduction. It's great to be here, and I know you have some great questions lined up, so this is going to be really interesting. I mean, you already presented what I do, but what I'm kind of thinking about right now at Milkywire is selecting new, innovative, interesting startups. We try to be a catalytic buyer in this climate transformation fund and support tomorrow's solutions and help make this a successful startup decade, so we can kind of build the foundation for larger scale. So in our purchases, it's not about the cheapest ton today. It's not about just selecting the best-in-class solutions already, but also looking at sort of what are the promising things. And we actually have we got 270 applications this year from different CDR suppliers, and 120 of them were Biochar. So we're kind of neck deep in that, and evaluating a lot of super interesting proposals. And to help us with that, we got funds from Klarna, Spotify, Salesforce that are interested in kind of supporting that kind of work.
Well, I mean, nothing brings music to my ears more than hearing that, because I even remember, it's been remarkable to kind of see the growth and the trajectory as even the last 3 years when it comes to a lot of these CDR methodologies. And I think biochar is really starting to pick up as one that's highly credible, especially because deliveries for some of the other portfolio elements have lagged behind a little bit. And of course, we've had elements that have driven, for many reasons, some credibility issues and transparency issues in the marketplace. So kind of going back, knowing that roughly 123 of those projects were biochar, so that's a big slice of pie. How are you seeing, or how are you approaching the discussion around dual goals? When you think about energy production and biochar, certainly here in the US, we've had major issues. My past life came from doing energy as a service, microgrids, building resilience. We're going through an inflection point in this country around interconnection with the grid. So leveraging feedstock to do multiple things and leading to energy production is very important. How do you see that fitting into the broader carbon market?
I think it's super important, and hadn't thought a lot about the question how to best use biomass and like what are the best CDR methods when it comes to biomass. I think that going back to kind of fundamentals on price actually tells you a lot of information. There's a lot of info baked into price. So if a supplier is able to get like an offtake agreement for their energy production or selling heat, which is quite common in Europe, and of course selling the physical biochar, selling wood vinegar, bio oil, etc., that also means they can be more competitive selling the carbon removal credit. We're still kind of in an early stage, and it's a nascent market, but ultimately, and this goes for other biomass solutions such as biomass direct storage, kind of biogas separation, and many other ways where you use the biomass. The ones that have the greatest value will also be able to have a lower price for carbon removal, and I think those are the ones that will be able to scale the most. And you can see that in the global south, many producers may have a harder time to get income from these kind of sources, but on the other hand, they have lower labor costs and so on. So I think it's especially important for producers in the US and Europe to make sure they have these kind of secondary income streams to also be able to compete, because I think down the line, carbon removal will be in competition with each other, even though the early stage buyers like ourselves we've been accepting very different price points. So paying everything between like $50 and $2,000, like it's really far from a commodity. But I still think we're going to end up in that place, and people are going to buy carbon removal as more of a ton is a ton for durable carbon removal at least, and then price becomes quite important, and to have a low price, you need to maximize the value of what you're doing, basically.
Value maximization is key, and really defining those input pieces. I mean, the cost components, as you've alluded to, when you think about biomass energy, there's several stages, and thinking about even the elements of feedstock collection, pre-processing, conversion, energy generation, each stage is going to carry distinct costs, and that's mission critical when you're thinking about the kilowatt cost, the averages, the economic viability, and then ultimately trying to drive the cost effectiveness of the projects. And we know, certainly with biochar production, the costs vary, and that's part of what we're trying to do is in addition to measuring the social cost of carbon, which you and I will get into a little bit more, we also have to look at all the other pieces, and then understand what the offtake is going to be, and is there a play for things like power purchase agreements, virtual power purchase agreements, RECs. There's huge demand still there. for that, particularly again in the U.S. market, and that's something that we look at very closely at Grain. But no, thanks for that analysis, and obviously a lot of people are familiar with the ton is a ton argument or discussion there, so I think it's important to build off of that. Now let's come full frontal on kind of the carbon markets. I mean, this is something we hear all the time. We're constantly getting questions about the future of carbon markets. Obviously, administrations change, but you've got regulation, you've got voluntary markets. From your unique vantage point, what do you see is the future of carbon markets in the U.S.? How can project developers and investors really support this industry's success? I obviously will provide some insights from my perch here as well, but I really want to get your thoughts as you've aggregated at the macro and micro level, and again, with a lens to the U.S., but we can also talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the EU as well.
Yes. So globally for the voluntary carbon market, I think there's essentially three different markets. It's one for the traditional credits, like avoided deforestation, renewable energy projects, and then some of these kind of improved forest management, etc., that you have in the US as well. And that's one market. Second is carbon removal through forestation, like kind of plantation or afforestation and agroforestry, etc. And thirdly, we have durable and permanent carbon removal, which it's sort of its own market with its own dynamic. And they're having a little bit different trajectories. They have different use cases. So if you want to reach net zero, you still have fossil emissions. You need to use permanent carbon removal, for example, according to the SBTi and other guidelines. And there's a different set of buyers basically for each. I think that the old school traditional credits are having a tough time. They have been dropping from a peak. There's less of a use case. There's been a lot of hope and a lot of expectations, but that hasn't come to fruition. And that goes between kind of trading between countries as well. Whereas permanent carbon removal has gotten off to a good start, and we have a group of kind of strong buyers, and we have lots of suppliers that have come in. But of course, there's a need for more buyers to continue that growth, because otherwise it can easily plateau, and you can lose a lot of suppliers and kind of lose a lot of people. When it comes to kind of a US perspective, I would say like the voluntary carbon market is very global, and so many buyers kind of buy from any country in the world. Suppliers sell all over the world when it comes to that kind of ECM. But of course, there is a little bit of a premium, or many companies are interested in buying within their own country. And if US companies are going to double down now when there's kind of other political winds, or if that makes them take a step back, that's, I think, remains a little bit unclear. I mean, maybe both, like different companies may react differently. And of course, these kind of subsidies and tax credits, etc., we'll see if they remain. Also something that people talk a lot about, but I think there's a lot of guesses, but very little to anchor that in, kind of what will happen with that. I would be very surprised if there will be kind of any type of compliance market in the US in the next coming 4 years at least, like that would mandate anyone to buy carbon credits. But there could be plenty of voluntary demand if companies can step up.
It's a unique one. I will say a couple of things. I was very fortunate. I got to, and I referenced a lot of your work on stage to kind of educate a very large audience of investors in New Orleans recently at the Projects and Money conference here in New York City, here in New Orleans, not here in New York City. And one of the topics really was understanding what states maybe could align around compliance. Certainly California and New York were ones that drove a lot of interest, but there was a lot of really intrigue around the value proposition. I mean, I think the stats I heard were 80% of IRA monies went to red states, and about 60% of new jobs. And a lot of the people I've met with in Washington, they've got these constituents that are tied to the people that are making and doing things across the country, whether they're farmers or whether they have lumber mills or sugar mills. So I tell people a lot, that it's really going to come down to one, economics, but also a thing I think, Robert, that isn't getting enough attention is like the 45X tax credit. In the US, there is a demand to we'll get more on the technology side, but manufacture more. I think this is something to look at. So in order to drive supply and demand, buyers are also looking at projects that have good TRL levels, technical readiness levels. So we need, the technology is really critical. I'm with you on, I think that trust and transparency and demonstrated value are going to be the core drivers. To your point, we talked briefly about, the projects you're looking at. Well, you're not going to get in on all of them, but what projects are de-risked the most that can then lead to the necessary upside for investors to engage. The last thing I would flag, and I think a lot of us are waiting on, is incentives. In the US right now, we have, at least for biochar and for DAC and CCUS, there are incentives with the 45Q tax credits to either provide tax equity, ITCs, PTCs, production tax credits, and then reimbursing farmers to take biochar. I tell people all the time, I mean, I've been blown away, and many people on this call will attest to this, with how poor the soils are across at least the US. I can't speak as much to the EU, even though I lived there for 4 years. I wasn't at as many places. So understanding that these soils, they've lost porosity, water needs filtration. We're trying to build up water infrastructure. So I think it's going to really have to tie in to the economic story, but we're going to rely more heavily than ever on CDR.FYI and companies like Milkywire to drive confidence. The last thing I'll say is what got a lot of investors in the space early was the VCM, because they would say, oh, wow, Milkywire, Shopify, Stripe, Microsoft is engaged. This de-risks the investment opportunity. So it might not have been part of my traditional renewable portfolio, but because those pre-purchasers are engaged from a forward contract perspective, we will engage. It's worth the risk. And they may be a company that's not on the traditional beaten path, but I really appreciate your lens on that. I think it's super critical. And again, for those listening, please make sure you're following Robert on LinkedIn, because he's posting. We could talk literally for hours on just this topic, on all the things that you posted tied to that. But that's a little bit of my perspective. And I will tell the audience, I've met with some of the senators and congressmen, that represent these places, Grassley and Bozeman and, Sheldon Whitehouse from my home state of Rhode Island. They're very confident. And this is a truly bipartisan. Most of the stuff we're talking about today is bipartisan here in the US. Robert, going on, quality is a big question. Stability is big. I found myself a lot of times tap dancing because of some of the negative press, whether it's New York Times, it's The Guardian, it's Carbon Pulse. We need to be lifting each other up more in this market than tearing things down. There's always going to be bad actors. How do you talk through, as somebody that's very involved in these conversations, how are you navigating the concerns around quality and stability of the VCM, and what guidance would you have for people on the phone that are trying to, leverage and convince others that this is in fact a great opportunity and it should be considered, from the lens of their project?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, when it comes to durable carbon removal, the first thing we would have to explain is that it's different from a traditional carbon credit. I mean, you can see its difference because it's already like 30 times as expensive or something like that, at least. But explaining why that is necessary, why you need permanent carbon removal, would be kind of the first steps. But then it's a very nascent ecosystem still, even if you come very far in the last 5 years. And some solutions are a bit more mature, like Biochar, even if there's small things we can sort of iron out there as well when it comes to quality. But there's some other solutions that are a little bit more to prove on exactly how to measure this in the best way, to make sure that we're removing carbon in a safe way. And there are risks in the coming year that we trip up on ourselves, maybe start delivering too many credits too early from pathways where we're not exactly sure how that's going to be measured. So I think it's to really maintain quality and trust for permanent carbon removal as its own category. We have to be super careful there. And to some extent, I'm glad that it hasn't sped up enormously. So people just go out and do all kinds of stuff before there is strong protocols and so on out there. And sort of that we do this testing phases, scale up in a fast but still kind of sustainable manner, and not get too much ahead of ourselves. I think that's really important to remember as well.
This topic is one to the points you said, I mean, those are really important bullet points that people can extrapolate on depending on the type of project and how they're approaching it. There's for those that might be familiar, there's an economist in the US, Robert Schiller. He's really known for work in behavioral finance. And like the thing that always comes to my mind, and this is what drove some of the major issues early on, is the idea of moral hazard. We saw this with some bad actors around, forestry in the early days. And this stuff tends to bleed out to other things. And I think that, asymmetric information can create incentive problems. And adverse selection and moral hazard can cause issues in offset markets. And I think that, we'll talk a little bit more about additionality and permanence, and what a broad brush potentially means without proper consideration of context and implication. I already see in the Q&A we have a few questions on additionality. It is a red hot topic, and it's one I get a lot when it comes to things like quality and stability, and also acting as a, credits acting as a backstop, because let's face it, a lot of times you see credits trading at a very low cost, and sometimes at a higher price point. Same with the offtake. The offtake could be at a low price or a high point. So you've got lots of questions that could potentially undermine or make it very easy for people to kind of try to jump through hoops faster. So I think it's very pertinent, and it's really a big part of the story. But tying into this too is the whole concept of carbon accounting. You've been very active talking about, and you highlighted it a bit at the beginning, like for like removal principles in carbon accounting and the impact in achievement of net zero, GHG and CO2 and net zero warming targets. Can you please, you're going to do it way more eloquently than me. Can you reframe this for people, because it's very confusing, and maybe give a little bit more context around, origin and significance. And I'm going to be taking notes as you go as well, so I can ensure I deliver this message going forward too when I get the question.
Yes, great question. It all comes down to the origin of net zero. It's more than 15 years ago where scientists discovered really that, we can stop temperature from increasing if we reach a net zero state where there's no more CO2 being added to the atmosphere. Before they were talking about stable CO2 concentrations, but that's not the same thing as net zero. And it follows scientifically that if you continue to emit CO2, which it remains in the atmosphere and has a warming effect for tens to hundreds of thousands of years, that if you don't remove the carbon in a similar time frame, or at least for a very long time, that you are going to shift away from this net zero state and instead have warming again. So if you plant forests to continue to emit fossil fuels, then that's a very effective and cost-effective climate solution. But it's also carbon that is at risk of being re-released. So if you want to have the license to continue to, for example, burn jet fuel, to really reach this geological net zero state where it's equivalent to not emitting at all. So like you would have that ability to continue to use jet fuel, then you would have to durably remove that for many hundreds of years. Otherwise, you don't have that kind of same stable equilibrium that you had before you emitted the fossil fuel in the first place. But if you have shorter-lived greenhouse gases like methane, and that only exist in the atmosphere for 12 years, if you would like to reach a net zero greenhouse gas emission, you could use much temporary removal. Or if you have deforestation emissions, bringing back that carbon to the same state as it was before by planting trees would make sense. It wouldn't cost the same kind of trouble as if you did it with fossil fuels. And that's what's called also the like for like principle. So it's a scientific concept that comes from the net zero science, but the like for like idea, I think, the wording originated within the Oxford Net Zero and Oxford Net Zero principles.
Okay, I have a much better comprehension now to be able to explain that. I can rewatch your answer. I'll probably need to rewatch it a few times. So it
wasn't perfectly. I think if I write it, it's going to be better, and I have written about it. But yeah, it is. it's not that easy to explain without unnecessary words. So yeah, we can try again another time.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, look, in this world that we operate in, context is the key. And, you know, at the end of the day, like priority, somebody said this to you, like priority is a function of context. And that's, you know, to prioritize these things, you have to have the right context. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this talk today, because so many people need the right context. And again, the audience is so broad in representation. I mean, but this again, the paintbrush is across the lens, Robert. So it's important.
And I think a crucial thing here is that there's a big difference between the question, what should I do in order, if I continue to use fossil fuels, what do I have to do to kind of be able to do that? And then you need permanent carbon removal. That's a very different question from how should I spend $10 million on climate in the best way? Like these are like very separate, but we often confuse them. So if you just want to finance climate solutions, then planting trees, kind of doing emission reduction projects that you pay for in other countries, stopping deforestation, those are super valuable, super cost efficient, and like very worthwhile doing. But it's just a different thing than from what do I have to do to counterbalance this remaining fossil fuels that I'm going to continue to have.
Yeah, it's precisely right. And I mean, but at the core of it, and I, you know, I was fortunate in my early career to kind of study some of the stuff around Lean Six Sigma and efficiencies. But the core of the whole thing was if you don't know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. So you need context, but without context, you can't ask the right questions to then drive to the output that is most desirable for your situation. And that's the whole point. But you still need to, and this is again why what you're doing is so critical, because you are giving us as a community the context with which this audience can work with a company like Grain to be able to achieve their ambition. So it all, and then they go back again to CDR.FYI and Milkywire, and we've got this really nice 360. It's closed loop. It represents whether it's circle of life or it's circular economy, which you know I've been all about for 2 decades. I mean, this is critical. So no, I appreciate that, and let's definitely this. I've made note. This will be a follow-on item to produce some more content around it, because it's such a good one, and it's one that really deserves more airtime, more visibility. It's a key one. Now, speaking of those publications and the work that you do, obviously, you know, in a recent survey, pricing survey you put out, which I read with great interest, you highlighted a significant gap between suppliers and buyers' price expectations for CDR methods. This is a question, I see it in the Q&A. It's blended amongst lots of people. What strategies can developers implement to bridge the gap and really ensure scalability and economic viability, not just of their own projects, but really the technologies by 2030? And even goes back to the things I was highlighting earlier around manufacturing and scaling here in the US. All that's about making things. So I'd love your perspective on this one tied to that op-ed.
Yes, there's a lot to say about that, and that was a survey that we did. We have a big team at CDR.FYI that contributes, but we also did it together with Opus, a Dow Jones company. It's kind of reaching out to their customers as well. So we got a lot of good replies, and we could see that there is this misconception between what should a cost of a ton be and what do the suppliers actually need to break even. And one thing to start with is this could be a function of kind of just different expectations. It doesn't have to be that this is the only price that these buyers are willing to pay. It could be that they think this is what they're going to pay, but once they get informed that costs are actually higher, they would be willing. So that's one interpretation. Like we can hope for that. But I do think it points to a trend that where the next wave of buyers is coming, when we're moving from these early innovator buyers to kind of a broader group, there will be more focus on price. And the methods that have a higher cost per ton are going to have to compete with the ones that are lower. And you just have to be really ruthless on cutting costs to be able to compete. And that could be also involve getting other types of income streams, as we talked about, from energy and byproducts and so on. Yeah, and also to survive until the kind of next wave of buyers come, but that's a bit separate. So yeah.
Yeah, I think about three things. You know, there's always break-even points for suppliers, and you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about many conversations I'm having. I'm actually taking some notes relevant to a couple of projects that we've been talking to about. You know, not just what the investment in the technology looks like, but how to achieve. I think all the time about economies of scale because that's super critical. You know, achieving economies of scale will be crucial for suppliers to reduce costs and certainly reach break even. And then obviously, you know, the market demand piece and what we do as a group. And then, you know, from an engineered CDR perspective, you know, thinking about the costs, you know, and the cost tied to deliveries. And then ultimately, you know, what we need to do to kind of get to the ballpark baselines again in alignment, which we'll get to again in a little bit with your breakdown of the decades and how you've kind of teed up, you know, because it's all a function of that. It's all a function of what we need to do decade to decade. We can look at kind of the baseline costs we see today, but at the end of it, doing surveys and getting that, you know, that raw information and compartmentalizing it and bringing it to life is very, very valuable. It's very important, and it feeds in, Robert, to commitments, because this is again another area where Milkywire just shines. I mean, you know, and congratulations. I mean, big news. Salesforce, maybe they'll be named Agent Force soon. We don't, you know, TBD. We'll see how things go there. But ultimately, you know, $5 million is $5 million. It's still significant. And that's a commitment to pre-purchase durable carbon removal credits for Milkywire as part of the $100 million CDR First Movers Coalition pledge. And again, I don't have enough fingers to count how many folks have reached out to us or as part of the Grain platform that are very eager to engage with Milkywire. And they're on this call and they're very curious to understand, you know, what this means for the impact and the acceleration of early stage, you know, CDR tech, the ecosystem, and them as developers. You know, so can you share a little bit more for the audience that might not be familiar, and then maybe a lens with how people can think about approaching, you know, you all for access to those commitments?
Yes. Yeah. So Salesforce had signed a contract with Milkywire about catalytic carbon removal purchases. So this kind of early stage innovative. And as you said, they have 100 million in total and kind of working with Frontier and offtake agreements and so on as well. And $5 million is of course significant, but small in the greater whole, but it can be put to great use for these kind of early stage new things, taking a solution from idea to inception, taking something from the lab, going out and building a first production facility of a few hundred or 1,000 tons, proving it out, getting this kind of case study that it works. We can see where we can go from here. And that leads to investors, as you already mentioned. That's one of the biggest things that we see with the CDR companies that we have been the first buyer of, that unlocks investments, that there is that more credibility, and you get a lot more data, because what we don't want is to have great ideas being untested. So I already know of a few very promising idea that didn't go anywhere because the company didn't really get started, and that we don't want to see that for a lot of ideas, because we're still early in CDR and it's too early to double down on this is the default approach. So $5 million, and then we also have Klarna and Spotify and about 20 other donors for the Climate Transformation Fund that can support this approach as well. It can go far for those for the early startups, but then of course you need completely different level of money when talking about scaling it up.
Yeah, well, you know, something has to be done about great ideas. I'm very excited about this collaboration. It's a good sign. Obviously, we've seen Salesforce. They've been very active. It seems like every capital city across the U.S. has a Salesforce tower. So it's highly recognizable with many people that may not be familiar with carbon markets. So it's a way to accelerate trust. And I think that in addition to it, I know that there's immense interest in the co-benefits for communities and ecosystems. I mean, it's one of the reasons, you know, I was very fortunate early in my career, you know, Robert, as I briefly told you when we met together, I was doing access to energy work in, Middle East, India, Africa. And, for me, a big part of all this too is aligning with companies that help drive scale, but also care about communities. And access to energy is a basic human right. And I think that companies like Salesforce and Schneider Electric and many others that are on the CDR.FYI platform, they do care. So this is a testament to so much more. But that money will go a long way, because if it can help prove out, credibility and get some projects online, it's going to help many people that are on this call today in so many different ways. So exciting updates. Looking for a lot more of those coming up. When we have our next call together, we could dive into some case studies on all these other big businesses, and hopefully it will encourage others to engage. Because as I always say, courage is knowing what not to fear. And companies like people shouldn't fear this space. At the end of it, I've been on the record saying this multiple times. This is an exciting time, but we need visionaries to come to the table to help open it up and lead from the front. And we're leveraging learnings. I mean, it's all about learning. Why we do this stuff. Yes, we have great businesses that are aligned around a common cause, but it's really about awareness, engagement, helping build a formalized playbook for building this market. I mean, what should we be doing additionally, to build the CDR market? And when you look at the trends and the elements, I'm big on cycles. I mean, I've read a lot of books in my career about cycles. I think if we don't study the past, we're in a lot of trouble. I believe a lot of people would agree with that. So looking at trends, are there elements from your lab of research that you see repeating, or is this uncharted territory? What would you draw from, and what cycles would you want to highlight?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of people have been talking about renewable energy as a precedent, and of course, like it's been said many times before, but I do think there's a lot of truth to that. If you look at how the wind sector got started, like in the 70s, it was enthusiasts in Denmark, doing their own wind power plants, kind of scraping by, testing designs, almost getting bankrupt by kind of avoiding it narrowly. And then marrying that with a lot of state support in California, and then later on, kind of support from countries in Europe that wanted to do this, and then could have feed-in tariffs, etc. And we see a lot of similar things in CDR. There are enthusiasts. There's over 400 companies registered on CDR.FYI that are doing carbon removal, and there's so much tinkering and creativity going on. And we haven't locked in on a dominant design yet, so it's kind of all of this creativity is coming to a great use. But like, that's the starting point. The role of government is, of course, extremely important, and has been for most sectors. Semiconductors is extremely hot now. Many people know that NASA and the US government was like an enormous buyer of them in the 1960s, and kind of created the whole industry almost by buying everything that could be produced. And if it had to compete just on kind of companies and private individuals buying the early semiconductors, we probably wouldn't have O1 Pro now, I would guess, like from ChatGPT, and we wouldn't be that far ahead. So yeah, that kind of there's a lot of analogies to draw from that, and there's good papers. Like Greg Nemeth is a researcher who's been writing a lot about how solar became cheap, and then also what the CDR industry can learn from that. So that's a good analogy, I think.
It fascinates me. I mean, I always go back to a great humanitarian that we lost recently, President Jimmy Carter, putting solar panels on the White House in, I think it was 1978 or 79. And, he saw, and it's a byproduct of lots of things, right? Because for him, it was a time of, we had an energy crisis. There was elements of symbolism tied to it, but a vision for what we needed to do. So in many ways, he was a visionary. He saw beyond. And but lots of things drive these scenarios. And obviously, one of the reasons that I've stayed engaged here in the investment community in New York City is because, I've seen the growth, to your point, of renewables played a big role in energy as a service. There's a lot of money allocated to this. So if we could just get a subset of that capital into this space, I think we can move at the same hockey stick growth because people still had to, I mean, it's the same practice. If you pick the wrong blend of things, the wrong solar manufacturer, the wrong storage supplier, the wrong geothermal company, the economics won't pencil out. So it all comes to a head here. And I think, my favorite saying on this, Robert, is like, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Yeah.
And it's rhythmic in this case. And I think, I'm trying to study as much as I can. Nobody, can live by the crystal ball because that can get shattered anytime. Things change on a dime. But I think that we just have to be pragmatic. And obviously, I think this audience is going to benefit from your recommendations on things that they should read, things they should look at related. You made a couple reference points already. We could put some out post call for people. Maybe we compile a light little list for all attendees to check out. But but this is super important because you got to know where to go. A lot of life is knowing where to go to either get the right information or get the right connection point.
Of course, to some extent, we are in uncharted territory because if you talk about electrons from renewable energy, people can use them for whatever, even if they're more expensive, they still have, it powers your toaster or whatever. People want electrons. But for carbon removal, it's really only useful for companies and countries that want to reach net zero targets. Of course, we all benefit from that, but there's very little like natural demand. So it's more akin to waste management, maybe, but waste management is something that we see, and we don't want lots of waste piling up around our house. So we benefit from that as well. This kind of invisible thing, it is harder to draw good analyses on something that's exactly the same, which is, of course, it's exciting, but it's challenging as well because, it's sort of ultimately it's kind of governments having the mandate from their voters that this is an important thing that we want to do together, so maybe kind of drawing in all these to kind of other costly things that we do to maybe social spending in various ways, could be kind of space industries that are kind of when we went to the moon and things like that.
I will say from my vantage point, what concerns me, and this is baked, I think it's baked and rooted in efficiencies, but I've been privileged to be able to talk to a lot of big organizations with massive supply chains, and a lot of folks are looking, and look, people change roles, people go to new companies, they want immediate impact, so it drives people, Robert, as we've seen, to do the low-hanging fruit, which a lot of times is scope 1 and scope 2. So it's a quick win. It's a hard thing to do, to think about tackling elements, whether it's insetting in the supply chain, whether it's engaging in carbon markets. It's a little bit more of a lift. Again, the reason we're doing this talk and we're doing as much as we possibly can is to drive confidence and make it easier for those folks that can help us get there faster. Because right now, and you put out another great paper on this, we're getting great support from a lot of the service industry companies, tech companies, finance companies, which are fantastic. They've got great margins in their businesses, but we need more companies that have massive access to resources and supply chains. And again, a lot of the doers and the builders and the people that are dependent on the economies of scale and the things that these solutions can bring. And I think I always keep going back to that because I read a recent RMI report, and really the core of it was CDR approaches. And I've been talking to RMI for a long time. I mean, they're so necessary for various geographies and industries, and we just can't afford to wait. So it's figuring out, you got to find those right people and engage with those folks appropriately. Now, I'm going to ask you one last key question to kind of round this up. We have the Q&A has absolutely gone bonkers, which is fantastic. And I'm going to give you free reign, Robert, to kind of cherry pick. This audience, especially US folks, have heard from me a lot. I'm happy to lean in on anything, but I want to give you an opportunity to address the things that I think are most prevalent to your day-to-day. But I want to wrap this up with, as the title of our webinar suggests, we've been talking about advancing CDR from startup to scale up, which as building a startup and scaling up, I love it. I'm all about building. In closing, please share with us, Where do you think we're doing well to accelerate this space? And where do we need more attention from an ecosystem focused on making this space a success?
Yeah, I think I'm very happy in some sense with the start that this ecosystem has gotten to. I got seriously involved in 2020, and that there was just a handful of CDR suppliers that one could find, and a lot was left to be tested in practice. Now we actually went out and we have lots of data on enhanced rock weathering. We're doing progress on like 140 different direct air capture methods that are being kind of tested out. There's hundreds of biochar suppliers that are doing this all across the world. So it's not just a Europe, US thing anymore. So of course, but we need to broaden it geographically even more. But there's many things that I think is going right. And the ones that are driving it, I would say, are the kind of innovators, these kind of suppliers, the people starting companies. And I would want to call out investors actually, because I think I'm very happy with how it's still relatively little, but still it's significant how much VCs have gone in and put money into carbon removal solution, which is even more important than the early buyers, but they're going in tandem. Like if there's no buyers, there's no VC and so on. But that has been going well. I think there is definitely risks that we become a little bit too insular and talking to ourselves and not explaining to voters and politicians and the broader public why this is necessary. And if people don't get it, then there is really no future, right? We can sort of, and I'm very guilty of this myself because I kind of mostly socialize with other people who think about these things all day long and kind of talk to them on LinkedIn. And when I see someone commenting that I never heard about this before, maybe it's critical, I can feel, but it's still really important to bring everyone with us, because otherwise these early stage innovator companies, they're not enough. We need to explain these to thousands of companies that maybe heard about carbon removal and it's like, yeah, it's something for the future. We need to explain why it's important, bring them along, be patient. And the same with the wider constituencies, the voters that ultimately gives the power to politicians to do more on this. If we don't have that with us, then the cause is lost. And we can all do a lot on that, I think.
I think so. I'm an eternal optimist. We have to be optimistic. Sometimes I feel like it's daunting because the task at hand is so big. Especially when you've got the level of experience that you and I have in terms of the travel, the scope and scale we've been fortunate to do in our lives. But we're at a critical juncture and we can really turn the tide. And again, this is why I was so drawn to your recent write-up on the decades, because I agree 1000% with that analogy. I think what we've seen so far and some of the stats you highlighted earlier offers a beacon of hope that's going to, it's going to give us the tools to restore balance and secure a sustainable future. And I am excited by what I'm hearing and seeing from these investors. I've noticed a massive step change. I mean, I'm in countless investor meetings per week, came from working in private equity. So I was, again, like I said, I was there during that ramp up of renewables. And I do have a lot of confidence, but we have to keep at it. We have to be more resilient, but more engaged than ever before. So no, great insight on that. And Robert, really, I'm going to now give you some free reign. If you can see the Q&A, we've got some awesome questions in there. And as I always like to do, I think we should, the ones we don't address, we will note those down and we'll try to come back with some follow-ups and feedback from Robert and myself on those questions. We'll do the best we can. But Robert, feel free to pick a few. We've got some time let's go.
Great. So one question is about biochar being the cheapest permanent carbon removal, but not getting the recognition. Why not? And kind of asking, is it the gold standard? So, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder, probably. The biochar is leading in deliveries as well, as we can see on CDR.FYI, and is by far the most common thing that new buyers are buying. And I would maybe a DAC supplier would say, why is biochar getting all the attention? So it is kind of subjective. What was the vantage point that we're looking from? I do think that we talk a lot about biochar from my lens, where I'm sitting, but I'm hearing different things than others. So of course, the volume of these BECCS deals and some of the DAX deals are larger, but I think that has more to do with kind of the nature of like them building very large facilities and making very long offtake agreements. I wouldn't be surprised if Biochar leads in sales as well, like in a few years, but we'll see about that.
Yeah, and I'll only say one last thing. I actually talked with a large DAC, DAC manufacturer supplier, and they were also very optimistic about Biochar, or asking a lot of questions because issues meeting deliveries for buyers. And Biochar, as you just alluded to, is one that is delivering rapidly. So I think we could see some interesting things happening tied to Biochar, just because of people need things that will deliver, especially if they're active in the spot market. So I'm seeing more of that take place.
Then there's a question that we had these 123 proposals. So what are the unique areas of differentiation between Biochar suppliers? And this is what I'm sitting with right now. And yeah, it is very difficult. We also published our purchasing strategy at Milkywire, like as a catalytic buyer. And what we wrote about Biochar is that it's not too much of trying completely crazy ideas, because most people are doing a similar setup, pyrolyzing biomass and using it in soils, but it's more about identifying those that are uniquely well fit to scale it up, like have access to sustainable source of biomass, having great co-benefits, giving income back to communities, increasing income of people who are lower incomes, that may have some ecological co-benefits, that have a great team that is able to scale this quickly and sustainably. But yeah, that can be hard. And then sometimes people have twists that are interesting. But it's not like direct air capture where someone can come with like a completely new idea, where you never heard about this way of doing it, and they're doing it completely different than anyone else is doing it. And then you can, there's a little bit more differentiation. So yeah, it's more about that excellence part of things.
Yeah, and I'll say, we've looked at over the last 3 years, a couple hundred different biochar opportunities, from the hobbyist to the let's say folks that have done project development work for a long time, infrastructure. They've got cash flowing businesses, and it is in the eye of the beholder. It depends on a number of different things. But we try to start, Robert, with the jobs to be done to really understand and orient these projects in the right directions, because yeah, like you said, production technology, feedstock variety, application focus, geographical reach, all that plays a massive role in differentiation, I would say. So it's an exciting time for biochar, but you got to have the right things in place to optimize success. But there's a lot to like there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So a bit more questions on Biochar. What is your take on the recent publications suggesting that Biochar is not actually CDR? Yeah, I know what publication you're talking about. I commented on the author's LinkedIn, and we had an exchange. And I think in my read of it, he kind of gave me right, or like understood my perspective. I think Biochar is CDR, obviously, and the argument that he and some others have come with that is that's avoided emissions because it's crop waste or forestry, that you're avoiding emissions from that. But obviously it's carbon that recently was captured from the atmosphere, and it's more kind of a semantics. The more important thing here is that it's a category, and it's the use case of the category that's important. That particular question, is it just extra good avoided emissions or not, is something I've been debating for years, and it comes up now and again. But I think that most people, we're kind of having a solid understanding that yes, Biochar and also other solutions that rely on biomass is a form of CDR. For sure, you don't have to have these special plantations for it to be true.
Nothing to add. Perfectly said. Agree 100%.
If you see a question, because now there's a lot of questions and a lot of time. So if you that you see that you want
to, you're hitting all the. Obviously, biochar is extremely near and dear to my heart, but just keep picking them, because I want you to hit on the ones that are broad based as well, so we can paint that brush a little bit related to, because this is again, I'm looking at the people that are here. We have the whole world literally represented, which is fantastic. So no, feel free to go broad on some stuff if you see things that align, particularly with stuff that you've either put out recently or maybe have on the docket that could be interesting to flag.
Yeah. So there's one question, what do you think about direct ocean capture as well? I think that's one of several ocean-based CDR methods that is interesting. Direct ocean capture is similar to DAC in some senses because it's quite CapEx heavy and often very energy intensive as well. But you're using the ocean as your contactor, basically. Like that's the one that captures the CO2 and then you split it. And I think there's a lot of potential there with kind of co-location with desalination plants and a lot of places that already pump water where it could make a lot of sense to do CDR. And there's multiple companies trying out different ideas there, but we're not sure yet on kind of what's the best approach, I would say. But yeah, definitely has potential as well.
Hey, Robert, I actually will flag one to you because I would like you. I have a lot of thoughts and I've talked about this a lot. And any guidance from what you're seeing in the EU on, obviously, to be successful, you need, like, offtakes are critical in any market. In the biochar space, can you share anything maybe coming out of the EU in particular in terms of like top markets for monetizing biochar? Certainly, as you saw at our event that you headlined with a few other folks, we had companies that were there that were using biochar. You know, some for concrete and asphalt. We had some water infrastructure and certainly a lot of folks on soil. How are you seeing things play out with offtake? Any signs that you would flag that are exciting, particularly with a lens to the EU?
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the physical markets, both for heat and electricity and physical biochar, I'm less informed, right? I'm kind of follow more on the people that buy the carbon credits. So I don't have anything particularly smart to say on those kind of physical products, other than it's very important. We do see some offtake agreements on biochar. The big ones tend to be more located in the global south, probably because buyers it could be a function of cost, but also co-benefits. It's clearer that, increasing incomes and very poor soils that can have these kind of benefits. And Milkywire also bought biochar from 6 suppliers. All of them are in the global south. So, I mean, it's a similar approach. Not to say that it's not a good approach of doing it in Europe or the US either.
No, sounds great. I figured you'd have a little bit of lens. And I would just say that there was a recent study that came out, biochar to biogas plants being able to enhance methane yield. I think it was, by certain types of biochar increased production. In the US, we're seeing a ton of interest around that use case as well. Just something that was in the back of my mind that I read over the weekend that I wanted to flag. We have time, Robert, for one more. And then we will, unfortunately, have to wrap, but I do have a list of all the ones we have not answered. So we will do our best, like I said, to follow up on all of them.
Right. So maybe tackle the additionality one. Question that's about how should one think about additionality being hard for some products. Maybe some biochar providers are already doing their biochar production before carbon credits became a thing. And I know that more than half of US producers didn't sell carbon credits. So I can see why that's a thing. I would say that yes, when the market gets started, this is something that I've thought about as well, and looking at it granularly right now, it can be an issue, but it's very clear to me that biochar is not going to scale to these kind of hundreds of millions of tons or gigatons if not carbon credits becomes a massive part of the income. So I think we shouldn't be over fixated on like what are the other income streams right now. It's clear that it won't scale to that without carbon credits, and I think that it can be tricky for some projects to get the certification from Prover and others, probably in the initial stage, but kind of working through that, it would be less of a problem when you have that kind of scale up.
Oh, Robert, I mean, this has been a masterclass as usual. As I like to tell my whole team knows this. I usually, instead of starting my day reading the Financial Times and Wall Street Journal, I check out your posts and a few other individuals. It's real time, critical information. I guess just to wrap, I think many people probably here are already following you. Any places you'd want them to check out in particular? Again, we'll share some resources, etc. But any quick ones you want to highlight, so while they're captive audience, they can go and follow.
Right. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, and then my Substack is Marginal Carbon. That's Substack, and then CDR.FYI and Milkywire, of course. Resources on carbon removal, like there's the state of CDR, of course. They have the carbon removal podcast is doing a great job, and quite a few other resources, and I try to link to them as well.
Oh, fantastic. And the audience knows I'm easy to get a hold of, Jason at grainecosystem.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well. And again, truly enlightening today, Robert. I've enjoyed every second of this. I've got pages of notes myself here. I've been writing furiously. And I hope to do this again with you very soon.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a great conversation.